Issues, a podcast where we do in-depth discussions on a single comic book. I'm writer, wizard, mall Santa, and Rasputin impersonator Jonah Gregory, and with me today, my co-host Kieran Bennett.
Hi, my name's Kieran, and when I look at inkblot tests, the true horror that I see is a 450 fucking page comic book.
Yes, and today we are reviewing the Alan Moore. I don't know. I mean, it's definitely a classic, but it's also held in incredibly high esteem. So I have to say, going into this one, a little nervous because, we don't usually cover. I mean, we've covered a few, but this is Watchmen. It's held in ridiculously high regard. So yeah. It's an interesting one to tackle. So yeah, that's what we're going to be talking about today. This is a Patreon voted episode. So thank you to our patrons for suggesting the topic and then voting.
Thank you for suggesting such a quick and easy read.
The only problem, like, the length was fine. That's what she said. But the problem more was scheduling, and that's nobody's fault but our own and our jobs.
No. Ugh, jobs.
So thank you to Mike Urban for suggesting this book. Even though Kieran just dragged you for it.
I was not dragging Mike. I would never drag our patrons. They're all lovely and beautiful. I was, however, dragging the fact that this comic is over 450 pages long, and it took me a very long time.
Yes.
It would have taken me less time if I'd been reading the physical copy, but I was reading it on Comixology, and it always takes me a little bit longer.
That's fair. Yeah, I read it on Comixology. I actually, for the first time in a while, I actually went ahead and I've been reading Comixology stuff on my phone, which I'm sure is just, any comic artist out there is probably weeping to hear me say that. So for this one, I actually dug out my Kindle Fire. I have one I bought a few years back, and I basically only bought it because I wanted something really good for reading digital comics, which may be a stupid reason to buy a tablet, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper than an iPad or whatever. So, especially when they were on like the sales where they're like, hey, the new one's coming out in a month. How about, I don't know, $80 for this one that used to be $200 to $300. I'm like, sure, why not? So it's a good way to read them. It's significantly larger than my iPhone screen. And I have to say the scans of this on Comixology, at least on my end, because I couldn't tell when you had mentioned them if you meant they were good or bad for you.
No, they were not very good.
Oh, see, because on mine, they were very clear. So I wasn't sure what was going on there.
I don't know how Comixology functions. I mean, if I did, I'd hack it so that I could get unlimited. But I don't know how Comixology works. But when I was reading this on Comixology, there were bits that were very super crystal clear and other bits that were honestly just blurry. And I thought that my screen was dirty, and it wasn't my screen. Maybe it was my internet connection, but there were many patches on the scans of Watchmen and Comixology that were quite blurry. So
interesting. I have had pages load before where I had to like reload the page so that it wasn't like, I don't know, it was like a lower res version that it downloaded or something, or it hadn't fully downloaded. I don't know how that works. I probably should, based on what my day job is, but I don't.
It was kind of like when they'd put it on the scanner, bits of the page hadn't pressed flat against the glass.
Oh, weird. Okay.
That was kind of what it looked like. So some bits were like super clear and then other bits wouldn't be. So, okay. I don't know.
That is very odd. I definitely didn't have that problem. I was actually thought you were like, it was maybe slang I didn't understand, because I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. It does look really good. It's super clear, and I can zoom way in on these panels and they look like incredibly crisp, especially for art that's from the 80s. That usually doesn't, be like, you can zoom in on it, but you can definitely see like the lines, like the sketchy lines and stuff. But on that wasn't, it was like very, very crisp. I was incredibly impressed by that. So I'm sorry that your scan was less than perfect. That kind of sucks.
I expect nothing but perfection.
I mean,
from Comixology, the perfect company.
Yeah, they've done nothing wrong.
Owned by Amazon, who have also never done
anything wrong. By the way, we have to take bathroom breaks in buckets during this podcast if we need to go, because
yes,
we also are owned by Amazon. I didn't know. I don't know if anyone knew that or not, but
this podcast brought to you by Amazon.
I mean, if it was brought to us by Amazon, I would hope they'd pay us a little better, but they don't actually pay us at all. Only our patrons pay us, because they're the real heroes.
They're the real heroes.
All right. So before we get into Watchmen proper, now that we've talked about nothing for 10 minutes, hey, Kieran, Have you read anything else? Or was Watchmen too burly?
Funnily enough, I actually did. I don't know if you remember the last couple of episodes, I was feeling really guilty because I hadn't been to my local comic book shop for ages. I went to my local comic book shop and I picked up all my comics. So I picked up a bunch of new stuff. I picked up a couple of new issues of Domino by Gail Simone, which is really awesome. You should totally go check that
one out. Yeah, for sure.
I've been really, really enjoying it. It's just good stories, good fun, and I would highly recommend that one. And I also picked up the latest couple issues of Sleepless, which is also very, very good.
You've talked about that one a few times, and I still need to read it.
Yeah, I think I might need to go back and kind of like read it again from the beginning to kind of like get a little more context on some stuff that happened earlier, but still really enjoying it. So yeah, definitely go and check both those out. Oh, I also, I don't know if I talked about this last episode. I honestly can't remember, but I started reading the new Green Lantern comic.
I think you may have mentioned it, but
I did. Okay, never mind. Well, that's also good. That's
good. Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
I was just checking, and it looks like the first volume of Sleepless is currently available. Yes. Okay. So I want to make sure. I have been fooled where I tell people it is, then I check it again. And I'm like, oh wait, that says pre-order, and I totally missed it. So I will have to check that out now that it's been collected, or at least the first few issues have been collected. So that's always cool. I have been reading some stuff too. I actually checked out the Max meets Batman, or whatever it's called. It's like Arkham Dreams.
Yeah, you sent me a picture of that.
Yeah, it's I don't know if people that listen to this show are clearly hip, so they know who the Max is. But if you don't, no, it's fine. I'm not a comic snob at all. Like, it's from the early days of Image. It's not one of the first, I believe it was like their second set of comics that launched, because this one was not one of the main founders that left. It was Sam Keith, who had worked on some Wolverine, and that was like, I know, one of his big ones. I know he's done some Batman stuff before, and the way he draws Batman is insane. Like, he looks like, he reminds me of like when they would parody Batman stuff in Mad Magazine. Like, and he just looks like this weird buff dude, but with the ears are like super tall. They're like a foot tall on the top of his head and stuff. And the bat symbol almost just kind of looks like a weird like squiggle line or something. I don't know. It's a very strange but cool style that I really dig. And I've read the first 2 issues of that, and so far it's setting up a weird thing where like there's this evil scientist guy who's basically trying to break into the Outback, which is like this dream realm in the Max comics. So they're basically, so far it seems to be an excuse for Sam Keith to nudge and wink at the Max fans like myself that read it back in the day, but also throw a bunch of like just weird imagery with like Joker and stuff in it, and the Penguin. Those are the 2 that have been in it so far. And the Joker being like, oh, I totally know what the Outback is, and then making his head like come off his body with a giant crazy spring like a Jack in the Box. It's just like this incredibly strange but good art. So I'm interested to see where they go with it, because I think it's one of those that's only like a 5 or 6 issue mini series. So it's interesting so far. I don't want to say any judgment on it yet, because it hasn't had a ton of story progression so far, and it seems like if you didn't know anything about the Max comics, it would make absolutely no sense. So I don't think it would necessarily be a good introduction to that character for people. But the good news is the Max comics, they had a re-release a few years ago, and The Comixology versions were incredibly cheap. Like, I don't know if that was just like an end of year sale and a bunch of stuff was on sale, but I bought like 7 volumes of it for a few dollars a piece, like just within the last week or so, because I don't have my physical copies anymore, and I had heard really good things about those scans that they were like, because they actually went back for the re-release and rescanned all the old artwork at like a way higher resolution. Yeah, which was really cool to hear. So those are called the Maximized. So I'm very curious to go back and read that. I would like to review that officially for the show at some point, but it is also, like 7 or 8 volumes. So,
well, I mean, why don't we just smash it out then?
Yeah, like it's like One Piece. We're just gonna knock it out in one, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's why they call it One Piece, because you do it in one.
Yes, you do. You do the entire series in one piece of podcasting.
Exactly.
All right. So, we ready to tackle this beast that is Watchmen?
I mean, yeah. Let's give it a go.
Give it a go. All right. So I'm assuming that you might have some fun facts for us, because Watchmen and Alan Moore, just as a person, definitely have some fun facts about them.
Yeah. So I haven't really dug in too much into the Alan Moore comics universe, but I do have some fun facts about Watchmen and all the various things that have spun out from that. So Watchmen first came out in September of 1986. So, bit of a classic, and was originally 12 volumes. And Alan Moore originally proposed to DC Comics that he wanted to do a story featuring superheroes from a company that had been acquired by them called Charlton Comics. And the managing editor at the time was like, if you do this story, we won't be able to use these characters for anything else. Create original ones instead. And so he did, and that's kind of why you have Dr. Manhattan and all that sort of stuff, that they've never appeared in anything else.
Until now.
Until now. Well, yes.
We'll get to that.
Yes. We'll get to that. And so, originally appeared in 1985 in an issue of DC Spotlight, and then was eventually, pushed out into a 12-issue, maxi series from 1986 to 1987, and apparently DC Comics has produced 24 printings of Watchmen as a trade paperback as of March 2017. So, really just take your clubs to that dead horse and continue to beat it. I
mean, it's never not available, which is, that's good.
Yeah, but there are other comics that DC makes.
I guess.
I'm just saying. Okay, so they also did other things. Alan Moore, huge wizard, basically. Most prominently known for Watchmen. I would say that would be his most famous work. He did also write V for Vendetta, The Ballad of Halo Jones, and From Hell. Which I have not read, but is apparently very, very good. He also wrote that classic story, Batman the Killing Joke, and also wrote Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, substantially developed Swamp Thing, and also did The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Promethea, which I actually bought my aunt for Christmas, and I am yet to hear if it's any good, but I hear that it is.
I'm not familiar with Promethea. I am familiar with most of the other things you have mentioned.
Yes. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, the movie that was based on that, is one of those movies that as a young person, I thought was amazing.
Oh, really?
And
okay.
Oh, yeah. I loved that movie when I was
You're the one that bought it, huh?
Pretty much.
Bought the DVD, watched all the special features?
I think I actually saw it twice at the movies.
Wow.
Because I enjoyed it so much. And then I unfortunately revisited it many years later and realized it was actually complete garbage.
Oh, isn't that the worst? Going back to to an old movie.
And you're like, I can't wait to revisit the magic.
Yeah, I had that eye-opening experience when the Goonies came back out on DVD for the first time, and it was like this big hoopla, and I watched it, and I'm like, man, I have nostalgia for this movie, but it is unwatchable. Like, I don't know. It's one of those, you had to be there situations, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking so. Because I've also seen The Goonies and
But I absolutely loved it as a kid. I read the novelization of the movie because it was back when you couldn't find the movie. Like, you couldn't just go on Netflix or Amazon and like rent it or something. You couldn't even necessarily find a VHS of it to rent anywhere. So like, if you didn't know someone who owned it or you didn't have it recorded off of HBO or whatever, like when when you were pirating movies onto tapes that were shown on TV. You just didn't have access to it for years and years and years. And for some weird reason, I just was obsessed with it. And I know why. It was because the NES game Goonies 2, which has nothing to do with it, but it made me like really want to see the movie again. And since I couldn't find it, I read the book. So that's a little insight into my life. Into my weird
back to Watchmen. The art was provided by Dave Gibbons and the colors were done by John Higgins, both of whom have careers spanning 20, 30 years each and have worked on Green Lantern, Superman, Batman, The Spirits, Star Wars, Batman versus Predator. Just like... if you would care to name a company, the chances are that the two of them have worked for it in some particular way. Mm-hmm. But Watchmen, it's a giant cow and it's full of money. So you can't just make a comic about it. You've also got to make a movie about it. And I'm pretty sure that we're all familiar with the Zack Snyder Watchmen movie. Jonah, have you seen it?
I have seen it. I saw it in the theater. I watched it fairly recently, like within the last year or so.
Okay.
And I think it was because the director's cut came out a while back and I hadn't seen it right away. And then I was like, I'm kind of curious because I remember not hating it as much as most people did. But I also I've read Watchmen before and I liked it, but to me, it wasn't like a sacred cow because I hadn't, I don't know, as much as, I did enjoy it when I read it back then. I don't know. I just didn't, fully click with it maybe or something. I don't know. I guess I went into it not knowing anything, but I did sit down and read it in a single day when I read it the first time. I had a Sunday where I just kind of sat down and did nothing but read it all day. This was before I had kids, so I could do something like that.
Yeah, but what about the movie?
The movie.
Don't tell me your thoughts on the comic. You know how to ruin the podcast.
No, I said that was when I read it at first. So
right, okay.
So that was kind of why I'm saying I liked the movie enough that I actually watched the entire. Do you know how they did it was almost more like a motion comic of the pirate thing that wasn't included in the movie, the pirate comic subplot.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was a special feature when the DVD came out or if it was a separate disc or whatever, but I did watch it back in the day. So I enjoyed the movie when it came out. When I rewatched it, I was like, this is fine, I guess. It didn't bother me. It didn't, I don't know. It was one of those where I was completely neutral on it. This is entertaining enough, but I'm not angry about it either. Like some people were. So I don't know. What did you think?
Okay, I actually never saw it in the theaters.
Okay.
I never, I meant to, but I never did. So they did a movie based on Watchmen, directed by Zack Snyder, released in 2009 to, I quote, mixed reviews.
Mm-hmm. I believe that.
And spinning out of that, they actually released a video game series called Watchmen: The End Is Nigh to tie into the film and serve as a prequel, which, interesting enough, was written by Len Wein, who is the editor of the Watchmen comic, or who was the editor of the Watchmen comic. I've heard the
game, which is basically just a brawler where you play as either Night Owl or Rorschach, is awful.
It's not very good.
Yeah.
I can tell you that. It's not very good. They did also release Watchmen, the motion comic, back in 2008, which is an animated short film series, which basically just tells you the comic, which sounds like hell.
Yes.
To be honest.
That's an odd choice.
Yeah, I thought it was an interesting choice. But there are 3 recent properties based off Watchmen because you just cannot stop. There is currently in development a Watchmen TV series, which is apparently set to premiere in 2009, which, if you're listening to this at the time, is this year. Mm-hmm. And according to Damon Lindelof, who is the kind of show runner, he says they have no desire to adapt the 12 issues that Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons did, because those issues are sacred ground and they will not be retread, nor recreated, nor reproduced, nor rebooted. They will, however, be remixed because the bass lines in those familiar tracks are just too good, and we'd be fools not to sample them. So,
did you see the couple of pictures that have surfaced from the official Watchmen channel? Yeah, it's basically or not channel. It's a Instagram account.
Instagram, yeah.
And for people who haven't seen it, it is a few pictures of police. People dressed as police, uniforms, except their faces are completely covered by a yellow mask. The yellow that permeates everything Watchmen related that isn't the main comic.
Yes.
It's funny how certain things have been plucked from Watchmen and run with in the everything that Alan Moore hasn't touched.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It is interesting. It is interesting, isn't it? Speaking of things that Alan Moore hasn't touched, Before Watchmen is a massive
I've heard bad things about that one.
Is a massive ass series of comic books that were published by DC back in 2012, which was a prequel to the original Watchmen series. So it was actually 36 issues in total. Not all is one story, but if you wanted to get every issue of every story, you would have to buy 36 different comics. So, wow.
So 3 times as long as the actual comic?
Yes.
Okay. And were they little stories that focused on the various characters?
Yes. So there was, Before Watchmen, Minutemen, Silk Spectre, Comedian, Night Owl, Ozymandias, Rorschach, Dr. Manhattan, Moloch, and a $1 bill one-shot.
Okay. And did they miss the point of the plot of Watchmen?
Yes.
Okay.
Just
wanted to check.
So. Yes. Yes.
So we can move on.
Yes. By all accounts, the Before Watchmen Minutemen is very good. Written and drawn by Darwin Cook, who is actually a really good artist.
Oh yeah, Darwin Cook's
but apparently the rest of them are pretty.
I could
average.
see that one being good, especially with that artist on board.
The one that I've actually heard the most about. This isn't anything that I've actually read. This is just stuff that I've heard around the internet. Apparently, the Before Watchmen Comedian is horrifically bad.
I believe that. Is it basically when Batman tries to be edgy? Because that's what I feel like it would be.
I feel like that's what it would be. So now, if you're at all curious as to what Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons kind of feel about other Watchmen-related properties, when they kind of announced that they were going to do this Before Watchmen kind of thing, Dave Gibbons likes working continuously and having more employment because he's but a lonely comic book artist, and he says the original series of Watchmen is the complete story that Alan Moore and I wanted to tell. However, I appreciate DC's reasons for this initiative and the wish of the artists and writers involved to pay tribute to our work. May these new additions have the success they desire. Now, Alan Moore, however, decided to take a different approach, calling the project completely shameless, and said that he was not interested in monetary compensation, but rather, what I want is for this to not happen. And then he elaborated and said, what the comics industry has effectively said is, yes, this was the only book that made us briefly special, and that was because it wasn't like all the other books. Watchmen was something that stood on its own, and it had the integrity of a literary work. What they've decided now is, so, let's change it to a regular comic that can run indefinitely and have spin-off, and let's make it as unexceptionable as possible. Like I say, they're doing this because they haven't got any other choices left, evidently.
Yep. That sounds like Alan Moore.
That sounds like Alan Moore. It's got his full approval.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. I was listening to some interviews with him, and honestly, after listening to him actually speak passionately about things he's worked on versus what has become of them after his hands are no longer involved, he's not in the wrong in these opinions he's had.
Yeah. I don't have the exact source for it, but apparently he sold the rights to, I think it was the V for Vendetta film and the For Hell film solely because he just wanted the money from it. Mm-hmm. He never thought that they would actually make films out of his comics.
Right. And I think he had to fight to legally have them remove his name from them.
Yes, he did.
And he said it's because in one of the interviews I was watching, before this recording, he was saying because he's like, I have nothing to do with that. And he's like, the Hollywood will come and say, oh, well, we're changing this and we're making it, instead of it being about, his feelings on how the world was in the UK in 1980, the 1980s when it was like Margaret Thatcher and all this stuff. And he said the movie of Watchmen, they wanted to make it about 9/11. And he's like, so they're going to change this and add these characters and move this stuff around. He's like, then why don't you just make something else? And he's he's like, well, because then they can't cash in on, the name of Watchmen and his name of Alan Moore. Exactly. So he's very disappointed when he finds out people have only seen the movies that have been adapted of his works. And, justifiably so, I would say.
I think so. All right. And finally, Doomsday Clock, is currently being written and is sort of a sequel to Watchmen that also ties directly into the DC universe. Issue 8 came out just a little while ago. I've read the first 2. So far, pretty good.
Okay.
Pretty good.
Yeah. I'm curious. I have to say, out of all the, other stuff that they've done with Watchmen, that's the one I'm actually a little curious about.
The only reason I'm partially hopeful. Yeah, partially hopeful is because Jeff Johns is currently the writer for it. And I think he works best when he is working on like a long form, planned out, like epic story. Mm-hmm. And like, I think that's what he does well. So yeah,
that's fair.
I'm very hopeful to see like how it all kind of brings together, in the end. But that's not slated to finish until like June 2019.
Okay.
So have some time to go.
Yeah.
And those are your fun facts.
All right.
It's probably some of the longest fun facts that I've ever given.
Yeah. Well, that's fair. It's a long book with a long and sordid history.
Mostly full of Alan Moore being really disappointed.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that does happen when you sell movie rights, I guess. All right. So let's get into Watchmen #1, At Midnight, All the Agents. They all have their own little name that kind of goes along with them, and they all end.
That's how you know it's a real comic.
Yes, they also all end with a closing quotation, so it's very classy. They also pretty much all of them open with a lot of prose, like several pages of prose.
Oh yes,
this is a book-ass comic book, just so you know going in. All right, so. It opens in October 12th, 1985. I was 5 years old, but that has nothing to do with this comic. It just shows how old I am. 2 police detectives are investigating the murder of a man named Edward Blake, who was forced out of his apartment window by an unknown assailant. And this is where we get the very famous smiley face with the bloodstain on it.
Yes. You know how that smiley face with the bloodstain on it is it's throughout all 12 issues. It's,
yeah.
Makes sense that it's now like just the symbol for Watchmen forever.
It is. Well, it was on the cover a lot. So as far as, reprints and stuff go. All right. So we get to meet Rorschach, who is one of the costume heroes who is now, costume heroes are always kind of vigilantes, right? But he's like the most vigilante-ass vigilante that they've shown. He's investigating the crime scene after the police leave and discovers that Edward Blake was the secret identity of the comedian, who is another former costume hero, but who had become a government-sponsored, quote, mask, that they call them, which are basically just heroes that are paid by the government to go in and, beat up people that the United States didn't like, which is pretty much everyone. So basically Russia, because this is the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
This is basically this is very much about the Cold War as well, by the way.
Is it?
Yeah. So we also are introduced to Dan Dryberg, who is also known as the Night Owl. And he is the guy kind of like with the, the gadgets and like the cool car and all this stuff. Or it's not even a car. It's like a crazy hovercraft, owl themed thing. So we get introduced to him, and he's coming back from meeting with an old friend of his who's a retired costumed hero as well, named Hollis Mason, who was the original Night Owl. So it's kind of a cool, like, passing of the torch, that they do in a lot of comics. Alan Moore definitely had worked around comics for a long time at this point, and, had worked on some major superheroes. So he definitely, reading this, it's someone who knew their stuff as far as like how comics, just how legacies are passed down and stuff within them. Which I thought was a nice touch. Like, it felt very genuine. Like, this guy, as they get into him, you find out like he was just a really big fan of the original Night Owl, and he's like, "Hey, so you're retiring? Can I have that name?" And the original guy is like, "Sure." So they became friends. It makes sense. But when he comes home, he finds Rorschach has broken into his apartment, and he's broken in because they're old pals, and he comes to tell him that the comedian was murdered, and that he suspects it's part of a bigger plot to kill off all the former mask heroes from back in the day, because a lot of them are retired, still alive, but out of the spotlight because, we find out more later as to, kind of a forced retirement situation. Did you ever see Incredibles, kids? Because it's kind of a similar government being like, "Hey, don't do this anymore. It's illegal now." But Dryberg, I think that's how you say it. I'm just going to stick with it unless you know otherwise.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. He tells Rorschach that he's just being paranoid because Rorschach's an insane person and everyone knows it. Like,
Rorschach is insane.
Yes. That is not even like me saying, "Oh, he's so crazy." It's like, no, he's literally supposed to be an insane person. So yeah, he goes down to, the local bar, as he always calls it, gotta check the underworld for clues. And he just immediately starts like breaking fingers so that he can get, so he can get leads.
Because he's just so wacky.
He's just so wacky. And he even pays a visit to his, one of his former, I guess colleagues, if all the superheroes are colleagues, this billionaire Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, as his name was when he was a crime fighter, and John Osterman, who is now the one actually superpowered superhero, Dr. Manhattan, and Lori Jaspesic. And I don't know if I'm actually saying that right. I think, did they say it was a Polish name?
Yeah, it's a Polish name.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm probably saying that totally wrong, and I apologize for that. But she's the Silk Spectre, and in the same way that the Night Owl was the second person to have that name, she's also the second person to be in that hero's, what do you call it? I don't know what word you would use. It's like if
mantle?
Yeah, mantle. That's the word I'm looking for. She's the second person to take on the mantle of the Silk Spectre. But of course it's Rorschach, so nobody takes him seriously because it's the crazy guy showing up to say, "Hey, someone's killing off us.
Everyone's trying to kill us."
Yeah,
yeah,
he's
sure.
Like,
whatever you
sure
say.
They are. Guy who smells like garbage and eats trash. So he wanders the streets of New York, pondering the murder, and Dan and Lori, because of the whole situation kind of shaking things up, they've kind of started to reconnect a little bit. They meet for dinner and reminisce about the good old days as costume heroes. And we're left with the quote, "At midnight, all the agents and superhuman crew go out and round up everyone who knows more than they do," which is from Desolation Row by Bob Dylan.
Quoting Bob Dylan at the end of the comic book?
I know.
This must be real.
Is that even legal? So, Kieran, what did you think? Now, I don't know if I asked you, was this your first time reading Watchmen?
This is actually my second time reading Watchmen.
So
Yes.
what did you think of issue 1?
The first time or the second time?
Both.
Okay, the first time I just plowed right on through because I was like a pig in mud and I loved it and I thought it was great. But that's not important. I was 16 or whatever at the time, so I had bad opinions. The second time that I read this, I enjoyed the first issue, but it's pretty dense, to say the least. There is a lot of dialogue. There is a lot of exposition and a lot of prose just throughout the whole thing. And don't get me wrong, it's very well written. It is very well put together, but it does make for a long read. It's a thick boy to say the least. So I think maybe the second time around that I was reading it, I was a little more aware of some of the flaws in it, which we can kind of talk about later. So I don't know if I enjoyed it as much as I did the first time that I read it. Especially since I knew how it was going to end. But I think if you didn't know anything about it, I think this first issue probably really would have like totally captured your attention. Jonah, what do you think?
So I first read it when I was probably 28, I would say, because I remember where I was living at the time. So that's kind of the age I would have had to been around about 10 years ago for me. And I did the same. Like I said, I read this entire thing in one sitting, so I just kind of plowed through it. Now knowing kind of the beats of the story better and rereading it again, I was really actually impressed with how early, a lot of the beats were being set up. Like it is a very, well told story in that, like he's definitely playing the long game of like, people are going to have to reread this to see all the beats that he's been setting up since the beginning.
Oh, 100%.
And that's probably a lot to do with the fact that it being a single 12-issue series, he could plan it all out ahead of time, where it's not like, you know, Superman that's just going to go on forever, where you have like little arcs within it. You know, this is, it's the benefit of writing a standalone volume like this.
A limited series.
Yeah. So I actually did enjoy it this time around as well. Like I have to admit, I did go in with a little bit of a chip on my shoulder because it's so many things you try and revisit from that era, like we previously mentioned, are incredibly problematic now. And very hard to get through.
There's some stuff in here.
And this definitely has some stuff, but I kind of just had to take everything with a grain of salt, and I was able to enjoy it still, kind of knowing that one of the points of the story is that a lot of these people are not good people. That's kind of one of the major plot points in this. So yeah, I actually did enjoy it this time. So, yeah. Do you want to get into number 2?
Yeah, let's do it. So Watchmen number 2, Absent Friends. Instead of attending Edward Blake's funeral, who is the comedian, Laurie visits her mother, Sally Jupiter, the first Silk Spectre, at her retirement home in California. Sally remembers the night the comedian attempted to rape her after the first photo shoot of the Minutemen, the first costumed hero organization. As the comedian starts to sexually assault Sally, fellow hero Hooded Justice interrupts and attacks the comedian. Back at the funeral, Adrian Veidt, who is Ozymandias, Dan Drieberg, Night Owl, and John Osterman, who is Dr. Manhattan, pay their respects. Veidt recalls the failed proposal of organizing the Crime Busters, a second costume hero league. The comedian speaks out during their first meeting to say that such an organization would be pointless since in less than 30 years, nuclear war would destroy the world. Dr. Manhattan remembers an encounter on the last day of the Vietnam War. The comedian is approached by a Vietnamese woman who is carrying his child. They argue, and the woman attacks the comedian with a broken bottle, leaving a large scar on the right side of his face. The comedian guns her down, and Dr. Manhattan, who witnesses the entire conflict, doesn't intervene. Dan Drieberg thinks about his time spent with the comedian during the riots caused by a protest, where the comedian seems to enjoy repelling the angry mob. And we then flash to October 16th, 1985. When Rorschach sees former costume villain Moloch leaving Blake's funeral, he questions him about the comedian's death. Moloch describes the comedian visiting him while drunk late one night, nearly a week before his death. He appears to be worried, fearful, and saddened, mentioning vague activities taking place on an island full of scientists, artists, and writers. He also accuses Moloch of being part of it because he saw Moloch's name on a list. After hearing this, Rorschach visits the grave of Edward Blake and pays his last respects. And our closing quote is, "And I'm up while the dawn is breaking, even though my heart is aching. I should be drinking a toast to absent friends instead of these comedians," which is from The Comedians by Elvis Costello.
Yep, those Brits, they just love putting quotes from bands they enjoy in their literary works. Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman are friends for a reason, I'm sure.
What did you think of issue 2?
It's definitely uncomfortable because there's a lot of showing how bad the comedian is of a person. And they do that in that classic way of making him a rapist and trying to murder and, well, successfully murdering a woman who he has impregnated, who's very pregnant with his child when he's in Saigon. This one is a lot harder to get through because the material gets so much darker so fast. Now, that said, it is still incredibly well written. It's just, this is where this ain't your daddy's superhero comic. Unless your daddy grew up after this comic came out, in which case it was every superhero comic because people learned the wrong lessons from Watchmen. But we'll get into that later.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I enjoyed about this issue, though, despite, the unpleasant stuff, obviously, was this is where they show how the world is different from our own, because it's not just that costumed heroes have shown up, but this is where we get our first insights into the fact that Dr. Manhattan isn't just a guy who puts on a suit. He actually is legit an incredibly powerful being. We don't know the extent of that yet in this, this part of the book, but I mean, they're talking about a play on the whole, last helicopter out of Saigon. It's the comedian being like, "Oh, I want out of here. I'm on the first chopper out of here." And you see like President Nixon, who, I believe at this point is on his third term because he changed the laws, for how many terms a president can serve. And, they're like celebrating their victory and all this stuff. Yeah. It's showing this is like history has been, greatly altered because of forces that they will, gradually show us over the course of this book, which I thought was a really interesting way to kind of introduce that fact in this flashback sequence. Because it's not all just shoved in your face in a way that's like, whoa, isn't this crazy? It's actually done in a really subtle way where you have to actually be paying attention to some of the dialogue and being like, wait a minute, this isn't how things went. I just think it was really well introduced, the whole alternate timeline that's happening. What did you think?
Okay. So I wasn't like super into the first issue. I recognized that it was good, but I was kind of a bit meh on it. I think the second issue, I still wasn't 100% in, but I was starting to get a little more in, again, because I knew how it ended. A lot of the stuff that they were kind of setting up here at the start, especially with, the comedian and kind of like what he did before he died. Like I found that a lot more interesting because I kind of like, I knew what the context behind that was. But I think kind of like trying to put that aside, like I have to give massive props for the way they switch back and forth between the past and the funeral. And it is a very clever way to give a lot of context and a lot of background to all these characters that have, unlike something like Superman or Batman, which obviously have a lot of history behind them, all these characters are original, reading it. So, being able to kind of in some cases visually quite seamlessly transition between the present and the past, and give kind of context behind all these characters and kind of show like what has led them to this point. Very excellent. I have to give like full kind of props, for that. The addition of, just a rape scene, like 2 pages into the comic, and then a pregnant woman getting shot in the chest, only a few pages afterwards. Well, a little much. Mm-hmm. A little much, I gotta be honest. But, I didn't think it needed to be in there, personally. Yeah. I don't think it's a necessary addition to the story. But, I can maybe understand why he put it in there. I personally don't think it should have been in there, but I didn't fucking write Watchmen, so what do I know?
Unfortunately, this is also from an era that, we're still not over, sadly, which is inclusion of those types of scenes just to show that someone's a bad person or to develop someone's character. It's like, yes, those things happen in real life and it's horrible, and it shouldn't be used in ways that are belittling to real world victims. And I think that it's a very, very fine line. And I don't think I can't speak. It's not my place to speak on whether this is a successful use of it in a way that is justified. Like, I think it could have been handled differently, but that's just my opinion on it. I'm not in a position to speak on that, I guess. It sucks that it's there is my opinion, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. But other than that, it was quite a good issue, and I was getting more on board with the story as a whole, by this point. Especially, I think, because by this point I was kind of realizing that, the point is that Rorschach is like a piece of shit.
Oh yeah. He's like a massive, massive turd.
Yeah.
And the comedian's even worse than him. So in pretty much every way. All right. So we want to get into number 3 here. The Judge of All the Earth. And this one, this is actually where it introduces some side characters that it revisits pretty frequently, which is a guy who runs a newsstand, and there's kind of a younger black kid who hangs out and smokes and reads comics that this guy just kind of lets him sit there and read all day. And at first he kind of complains like, oh, you never even buy anything. And then later he's like, well, the world's so screwed up anyway. Just keep the comic. I don't care. And we see that illustrated right away by the fact that right across from his stand, they're putting up a fallout shelter sign. So this building is becoming a fallout shelter right across from him because they're so close to nuclear war with Russia that basically most people are like, hey, is this the end of the world? I mean, it probably is, and that sucks, and there's nothing we can do about it. And they're constantly, showing us the guy walking around with the end is nigh sign in the background. And then the comic that I referenced when we were talking in the intro was it's this pirate comic about a guy whose ship is attacked by this famous pirate ship, and he's the only survivor, and he's lost at sea. And it tells this whole story of him like building this raft and using like the bodies of his dead companions to kind of buoy the boat, and all these crazy things that he goes through. And they all kind of parallel what's happening in the Watchmen main comic. So this comic within a comic kind of is there just to kind of illustrate and help kind of point out like, here's some themes within this other story that you're reading, which I thought was a cool way to do it. It also, I really thought it was clever the way that he worked it into the book, that because you're reading this like, okay, this is 1985. Why is a pirate comic the most popular comic book that everyone's talking about? And he actually gets into that more, which I thought was pretty cool. And it was, since masked heroes actually were a real thing people lost interest in those as comic books. So it kind
I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah. So it illustrates like, okay, well, what would take their place? And people still want those kind of adventurous stories. And before superheroes, it was like a lot of horror and pirate comics. So it kind of makes sense that people went back to the well. They were like, okay, these superhero things aren't selling anymore because there's actually people out here doing this stuff now. So you can read about that in the newspaper. So let's tell pirate stories and horror stories again, which I thought was pretty clever. And so that's kind of a theme throughout the book. But the main plot of this one, it starts with Laurie, who is in a long-term relationship with Dr. Manhattan. But we learn that he has become distant. He's losing touch with humanity, and that's illustrated through their relationship. So, it starts out with a sex scene where he's like off doing his own thing, but since he can duplicate himself, there's just two of him in the room, and she's just like, what the hell are you doing? And he's like, well, I don't know what you like anymore. I thought maybe you'd like that. So it's a very awkward scene, but it's kind of like, you could just see that their relationship is not working, because as much as he wants to make her happy, he's lost that part of his humanity. Yeah. He doesn't understand anymore, which they illustrated in that last issue when the comedian shot the pregnant woman. Was he's like, you let me do this. You could have turned the gun into vapor, or killed me, it's like, but he didn't act at all because he has like no, connection to humanity anymore. It's like, then this is further illustrated as their relationship breaks down. So she's angry. She goes to see Dan, because that's like her one friend still that isn't like one of these government agents that's basically there just to keep an eye on her to make sure she's making Dr. Manhattan happy, because that's the only reason she's like even allowed to be there. It's a very messed up relationship.
Yeah, it's pretty fucked.
Every way. And we find out Dr. Manhattan is actually going to be going on some like a talk show for like one of the only public appearances he's pretty much ever made. Like, he was active working for the government, and then he's kind of been off in this research facility. So it's like everyone knows he's there and does all this crazy stuff and has these powers. He's basically invented electric cars, and the fire hydrant we see the kid reading the comic up against is not even a fire hydrant. We find out it's like an electric car recharge station. So a lot of the technology has changed thanks to Dr. Manhattan for the better, because he's just like this super genius god being. So that's a thing in this world.
And he just happens to be American.
Yes, that is one of the running lines through the book, is that the Superman is real and he's American. So Laurie arrives at Dan's apartment and starts venting about her relationship problems. And they immediately, for some reason, decide to head down a dark alley and are attacked by a gang of knot tops, which are a recurring gang throughout the book, who are just like a bunch of street punk dudes. They just kind of seem to exist to just be dicks. Yeah, they're just there to be the generic, like, hey, we need someone for these guys to fight, or we need someone to get mugged or attacked. Then these are always the gang that's involved. But of course their old training kicks in, so they are able to beat up all these attackers, because they used to be superheroes, and Night Owl's not exactly in shape anymore, but he still knows how to throw a punch, so that's good.
He's still a pretty big guy.
Yeah, he is. So back on the talk show, Dr. Manhattan is accused by the Nova Express reporter of giving cancer to people that he's been close with, including his former girlfriend, and they never got married, right? Like, I was trying to check if they were.
I do not believe so.
Right. So they were a couple for a long time, and then other people he's worked with, a lot of people who were very close with him, they're now accusing him of, they're the reason he got cancer, that those people got cancer was because he gives off radiation, and, radiation it's the 80s. It's a very abstract concept to most people still. So, they just kind of run with that accusation, and he's just like, okay, bye, and teleports everyone in the audience and the station and everything else to a nearby parking lot. What an
absolute mood. Mood that is.
Yeah, which makes everyone else go crazy, because they're just like horrified to realize, like just how much power he really does have. Like he can just teleport everyone away, and there's nothing they can do to stop him. So he
could kill all of us.
Yeah,
immediately.
It's funny. They're like, wait a minute. You mean the man who can manipulate atoms can do whatever he wants? Weird. So they suddenly aren't feeling so happy about this Dr. Manhattan guy. So he can sense this because he's also like, I guess, kind of psychic or something. His powers are left purposely kind of nebulous, I think, so they can just kind of be whatever they need them to be.
Yeah, exactly.
To advance the story. So
I think he also realizes that things aren't really like going Dr. Manhattan's way anymore because he's not stupid. They're putting a quarantine area sign on his bedroom. Right. So, Yeah. So he decides that his presence is going to be more harmful than helpful to him and, humanity. So he teleports himself to Mars. As one does.
Yeah, but before that, he actually visits this old abandoned shack and takes a photograph of a man and a woman at a carnival. And, makes a little pit stop before going to Mars. And, of course, his departure makes headlines across the world because it's, Dr. Manhattan leaving Earth. And, of course, now that he's gone, Russia immediately invades Afghanistan because, America doesn't have their man that can teleport everyone into space if he wants to get rid of them. Or, as we see later, just make them vaporize. So, yeah, that's where it ends, is with everyone freaking out because now that kind of background noise of, nuclear war might happen, but it probably won't, is now, this is definitely going to happen. And that's where they leave it. And it closes with the quotation, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" From Genesis 18:25, attributed to God. So,
or the band Genesis.
Well, it might be. I haven't heard all their songs. So, Kieran, what did you think of issue 3?
I significantly enjoyed issue 3 a lot more than the previous 2.
Yeah, I would agree with you there.
I think this is the point in the story where it all kind of comes together a lot more. I find Dr. Manhattan a lot more interesting as a character. Well, at this point, at least, I find Dr. Manhattan a lot more interesting as a character than, say, the comedian who's just a shithead, or Rorschach, who is literally just insane. So kind of exploring a lot more of the stuff about him, I found a lot more interesting. And like the introduction of, the Black Freighter and kind of the global consequences of Dr. Manhattan and his presence on Earth, is like a really cool kind of framing device for everything that's happening, in the world. And you can kind of, I think, as personal as the story is, I think when the stakes get a little larger, I find it a little easier to kind of get invested in. Like it feels more like a big kind of superhero story. And I think maybe the reason that I kind of latch onto that a little more is because I think all the characters suck, which I'm aware is one of the kind of, intentions behind it. But it does mean that kind of some of the personal stuff is a little to me. But yeah, no, I really enjoyed this issue. I thought it was great.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like I said, I fully admit I came into this with a chip on my shoulder, and issue 2 did nothing to help that. But by the end of this issue, I was fully on board, and I was like, I'm actually enjoying this. I think more than I did the first time, because I'm noticing the setup beats being really well done for later stuff. It's definitely one that I think benefits from a second read, I would say.
I would definitely agree with that. Yeah,
because you see where all these threads that at first don't seem connected at all to... Like, I remember when I read it the first time being annoyed whenever the Black Freighter stuff came up, because I'm like, just get to the actual comic, what the heck? But actually really enjoying it this time around.
Yeah. All right, let's do issue 4, Watchmaker. This chapter covers key events and turning points in John Osterman's, Dr. Manhattan's life. In the wake of the bombing of Hiroshima, Osterman's father, who's a watchmaker, pushes his son to give up a career in watchmaking and become a scientist. John attended Princeton and then in 1959 becomes employed by a research lab in Gila Flats, Arizona. There he meets and falls in love with a lab worker named Janie Slater, who, we learned earlier, has cancer. At a carnival, a fat man steps on and breaks Janie's watch. John later fixes the watch but forgets it in his lab coat. When he goes to retrieve his lab coat from the test vault, he gets accidentally locked inside. Whoopsies.
Yep.
When his fellow scientists return from their lunch break, John asks to be released. But to everyone's horror, the vault has automatically time-locked and generators have already begun warming up to begin an intrinsic field removal experiment. Yay! Waiting to die, John is disintegrated in a flash of light. A month later, ghosts of John begin to appear at the research site. First, a circulatory system, then a muscled skeleton, until finally he is assembled as a full being, complete with blue skin and fantastic superhuman abilities. Also a dong. Even though he retains his memories, he becomes distant and apathetic to those around him. He argues frequently with Janie, but pretends to still love her. In addition to his new, purely scientific outlook, he now has the power to telekinetically assemble and disassemble objects, teleport himself or others great distances, alter his size, duplicate himself several times, and more. He is quickly recruited by the United States military and renamed Dr. Manhattan. They dub him the first real superhero, which worries the remaining costumed heroes. Although he is the US government's ultimate weapon, he is unable or unwilling to prevent certain disasters, such as the assassination of JFK. However, John's incredible intelligence allows him to develop new futuristic advancements such as electric cars, safe dirigible airships, and more. Because it's not an alternate timeline without blimps. In 1966, John leaves In 1966, John leaves Janie for a 16-year-old Laurie. Gross. He becomes the savior of the Vietnam War and is allowed to remain an active superhero even after vigilantism is outlawed. The only other sanctioned hero left is the Comedian, who has also been drafted for government work. As Dr. Manhattan recalls Laurie leaving him, he creates a giant glass structure on Mars that rises from the soil. He then stands on its balcony to ponder a meteorite shower. And we close with, the release of atom power has changed everything except our way of thinking. The solution to this problem lies in the heart of mankind. If only I had known, I would have become a watchmaker. And that was Albert Einstein. I will say, straight out of the gate, before I ask you what you thought, this is probably my favorite issue.
Yeah, I believe it. It's an origin story. Sorry. It's an origin story, very well told. It's similar to some from, Golden Age comics or Silver Age comics, but has its own flavor to it, I would say. And it definitely plays up the horror aspect of Dr. Manhattan being blown into pieces. Like the frame of his atomized skeleton is it's amazingly drawn. It's all just black and whites, and you just have to see it. It's just fantastic. And the way he starts coming back as the different pieces of Dr. Manhattan after he's blown up, with, like you were saying, the ghosts with just the brain and circulatory system or nervous system. And then all that stuff was just so cool. It was incredibly well done, and it really pushed the story forward. I felt it didn't just exist to be whoa, look how cool this is. It was cool, but it wasn't there just to be cool. I also did enjoy how the progression of his suit is a helmet and a full body black suit with a belt, and he's nah, this helmet's dumb, and he just carves the little atom symbol into his forehead, which is why that's part of his costume. And that as the story progresses and it shows him going through time, you notice his costume getting smaller and smaller, which I just find hilarious, because in the modern, the 85 where it takes place, at that point, he's just not wearing any clothes ever, because unless he's at the TV station where he has to put on a suit because it's TV and no blue wings are allowed. He just did you notice the panel where he's trying to quell the riot in 1977, and there's a shot of him from behind, and he is wearing a thong. He's wearing a straight up thong. His ass cheeks are hanging out. It's in the 70s, he's still I guess, covering his junk, but after that, he doesn't care. I also like how they show the progression.
Probably because someone said, hey, Dr. Manhattan, I know that you're God and everything, but you were literally wearing a thong in the 70s. That was kind of weird.
Yeah. But I also really liked how they showed the progression of his powers, where they show early on, and you can tell based on what he's wearing, because he's wearing like the full body suit still. Like he's blows up a guy's head with his powers. Like there's some gang shot. It's like a one panel thing. But as it progresses and it shows him in, like in wartime, and then he's like 80 feet tall, just like destroying like the entire landscape. So it goes from like him knowing how to kill one dude and like dismantle a gun with his mind to, yeah, he can just kind of do whatever he wants. And you can tell because the neuter he gets, the less he cares about humanity, which means the more he's discovered his powers. It all comes together.
If you want to be psychic, just take your clothes off.
So, yeah, this is a really interesting and enjoyable issue.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about this issue, and I thought was incredibly clever writing, is that Dr. Manhattan is narrating all of this stuff as though it is currently happening, but also that it is still in the past. Mm-hmm. Because he says many times he experiences time like he experiences all time all of the time. Right. So, you know, the 1960s and the 1970s and him in Vietnam and him in, you know, meeting Kennedy in 61, it is currently happening to him at the same time that it has already happened. Mm-hmm. So the narration in the text boxes and stuff makes for a very interesting reading experience. And I think kind of by the end of the issue, you really sort of understand not necessarily how he views humanity, but sort of how he kind of experiences the world in a way. And I think like it was just some really damn solid writing to be able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. This, that thing where he exists like at all points in time that have happened to him is a really interesting wrinkle that becomes more prominent as the story continues. And it's just a really interesting part of his character because there's points at which he's like, oh, you're going to tell me this and I'm going to be mad. And she's like, why would it make you mad if you already know? And he's like, well, the me now doesn't know, but the me then will know. It's like, he can't even explain it why it's just linear time has no meaning to him anymore.
It's so interesting.
Yeah. It's kind of like, I don't know. Did you ever watch Star Trek Deep Space Nine? Because there's aliens in that where it's a similar kind of thing where they don't understand that, you know, other beings in the galaxy don't experience all of time at the same time. And that's what it reminded me of. So look that up, kids. Deep Space Nine, very good Star Trek series. I don't know if it's if it would be considered underrated as far as those series go, but I always kind of felt like it was. But yeah, that was a good issue. So, let's get into number 5, Fearful Symmetry. Here we return to Rorschach's story, you know, the best character, according to weirdos on the internet.
My favorite.
Rorschach returns to the home of Moloch. You'll remember him as a villain who they used to always get in tussles with. Now he's just kind of an old man with bad ears, I guess.
Yeah.
So he returns to question him more about the comedian's visit. He suggests, Rorschach, that is, suggests that the aforementioned list that his name was on was related to the press allegations that Dr. Manhattan had given cancer to his close friends ever since Jenny Slater's name was, made public. And she was also on that list. So he's trying to put all the pieces together here. Realizing Moloch was not involved in the plan, Rorschach leaves, but tells Moloch that there's this drop point where he can leave messages if he remembers anything about that night that the comedian visited him. So meanwhile, a man fearing nuclear holocaust has murdered his 2 children before taking his own life, and talk of Armageddon is everywhere. So this is the kind of side stuff that just shows you how the world is kind of falling into disarray ever since Dr. Manhattan left, because Russia and America were already at each other's throats with nuclear war kind of on the horizon, but as we mentioned, Dr. Manhattan leaving has really kind of just cranked up the heat on the Cold War. So Dan invites Lori over for dinner again, and this time because she doesn't really have anywhere to stay anymore because the government, basically now that she is not there to make Dr. Manhattan happy, is like, yeah, we don't need you anymore, and we've cut off your spending accounts, and you have no money or a place to live or anything. So they just kick her to the curb, because the government, kids, is not your friend and never will be. So Dan, being a good dude, invites Lori to live with him, because she doesn't have anywhere else to go, and they've known each other forever, and he's even like, this doesn't have to be like a weird thing. You can just stay here. He's like, I'm not expecting anything from you.
Then he makes it weird.
And then he makes it weird.
As soon as you're like, this doesn't have to be weird.
Yeah.
That makes it weird.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like saying, wow, this is awkward.
Yep,
as soon as you say this is awkward, it.
Yep. And then, Rorschach, ventures outside without his mask to watch the drop point in case there's a message. And we don't see his face still. Those scenes are all from his perspective, like looking out, which I thought was cool because they didn't want to give away, because they, I don't think they've said it quite yet, but like even the people that have worked with him for years don't know who he is. So it's not like the Justice League where they're all chums and they all are like, oh, hey, Bruce, and hey, whatever the other characters' names are that I'm blanking on, even though we've talked about
Clark,
Justice League
Diana,
for like
Wally,
200 episodes.
Hal.
Steve, he's probably a guy in there.
Yeah, probably.
Anyway, I don't know why I blanked on the entire Justice League, but I guess I just did that. Do you think
anyone in the Justice League forgets people forget each other's names? Like if Superman ever sees Bruce, do you think occasionally he's like, "Hey, oh God, I am so sorry. I know that we've met before, but I just cannot place it."
Yeah, I mean it's possible. I don't know if it'd be Superman forgetting. He's too nice. I don't think Batman remembers anyone's names.
No, but see, Batman's a genius and a detective, so he probably deliberately memorizes people's names.
This is true. Yeah, you got me.
Yeah, he probably has fucking little nerdy flashcards that he
Oh, you know who doesn't know anyone's name is Guy Gardner. Because he's an asshole.
Yeah, Guy Gardner doesn't care.
Exactly. All right, so back to this.
Diana is the only one who genuinely remembers everyone's name because she is perfect.
She calls everyone on their birthday and sends them cards every year in the holidays.
Yes.
All right, so back to the comic. So Adrian Veidt, who is Ozymandias, as we've mentioned, goes to a meeting and discussing these morbid things that are happening in the world, and that death and the afterlife and all these things with his secretary. And then an assassin jumps in the room and shoots his secretary, trying to shoot him. So she's going on about how man, it sucks that everyone's so morbid all the time. There's nothing we can do about it anyway. I mean, I could be dead tomorrow, wink, wink, and then immediately get shot. So, because he's the Ozymandias perfect man, he's still in incredible shape and is able to immediately subdue the assassin. And, he's like, don't you dare bite down on that poison pill. And the guy dies because, he bit down on a poison pill. Or did he? Yeah, right. That's our little peek into that world and the whole masked killer stuff that Rorschach is obsessed with coming back into play. So Rorschach, now back to him, he's responding to a note that was found at his drop point and goes back to Moloch's apartment to find him murdered. And also that this was all a big elaborate trap and the place is surrounded by police. He gets an action sequence that I'm sure gets a lot of the wrong people's blood boiling and pounding and loving it. The Rorschach burns a couple guys alive and jumps out of a window and basically shatters his ankle, essentially trying to get away from the police. So they're able to capture him and unmask him and stuff. So he's immediately arrested for the first time ever. So this is a guy that is been on the run. He's wanted for several counts of murder, not just this one that he's been framed for, but they kind of assume that he's murdered a lot of other people. And, they're probably right. And we're left with the quote, "Tiger, tiger burning bright in the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" I guess that's the way you would rhyme that. The Tiger by William Blake. And so that's the end of issue 5. So what did you think of issue 5?
I thought it was good. I didn't think it was as good as the previous issue. But I think like at this point, like a lot of the stuff is kind of starting to shape up and kind of come together. Mm-hmm. Rorschach still sucks. But everything else I quite enjoyed about this issue. I did actually look up, because the sequence where Rorschach is escaping from the police, I was immediately reminded of the sequence in Batman Year One where he is escaping from the police. Mm-hmm. Neither came before the other. They were both being released at the same time. So
interesting.
Just a coincidence that they both escaped from the police in, cramped conditions and set things on fire and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But yeah, no, a good issue. And I do think it was interesting to have some of the parts from the perspective, narratively and also visually from the perspective of Rorschach. So yeah, it was good. What do you think?
It wasn't as good as the last one, obviously, like you said, but, I did like how we get to know, Laurie and Dan a little bit more, and their relationship is kind of evolving, and, he does make it awkward, but I think it's just because he's an awkward dude who isn't used to being around women. It's like part of the problem. He's just this loner rich dude who just kind of lives in the past, and he keeps all his equipment in the basement, like kind of locked up, but he still goes down there to reminisce all the time. And, it's just he's just kind of sad, like, as a character, where you're just like, you just move on with your life, dude. Like, you're clearly like a smart guy. So I like their stuff. I did like the stuff with the side characters where they do some more world building, with like just the random people in New York, where they always kind of centered around the newsstand guy. And I really liked the pirate stuff in this one. This is where it gets really dark, where he's like floating through the water. He gets like seagulls start picking at the corpses under his boat. He eats a raw seagull and gets horribly sick. He's attacked by sharks. He kills a giant shark, and it starts dragging the boat away because it's a really crazy sequence, but incredibly well done. And I love the use of like the old style of, the coloring where it's all the little dots,
Oh yeah. The Black Freighter stuff is really well drawn. It's
so good. So yeah, this issue, I think those were my highlights. And then, we also get the unmasking of Rorschach, which shows us that, the guy with the sign, "The end is nigh," is him. Like that crazy guy they keep showing wandering around the city is Rorschach. So he's crazy in and out of the costume. Which I thought was a cool little wrinkle, because, one of the things about that character, when you read, Alan Moore's quotes about him, was how he's like, well, what if Batman was a real dude? He's less likely to be this suave millionaire guy and more likely to just be a crazy person. So, because, the kind of person who would dress up like that and beat up criminals and stuff is much more likely to just be a crazy person. Which, that's definitely his own take, and that's totally legit. Like, that is fair. So I did like that one. I liked that take on things. Did you want to get into the Rorschach quote now? Because it's very good.
Sure. So, speaking of Rorschach and how great he is and how so many people fucking love him, here is a quote from Alan Moore about everybody's favorite character. He says, "I wanted to make Rorschach as like, this is what Batman would be in the real world, but I have forgotten that actually to a lot of comic fans, smelling, not having a girlfriend, these are actually kind of heroic. So Rorschach became the most popular character in Watchmen. I made him to be a bad example, but I have people come up to me in the street and saying, I am Rorschach. That is my story. And I'd be thinking, yeah, great. Could you just like keep away from me, never come anywhere near me again as long as I live? So, yeah.
Yep. He's an incredibly disturbed person who maims and kills people. And smells bad and he sucks and he's mean to everybody. And even his one friend, Night Owl, is terrified of him. Like, he's kind of his friend because he's worried that Rorschach will murder him if he isn't his friend anymore.
Yeah, there is literally one moment in the entire 12 issues where Rorschach actually apologizes for being a huge dick.
Yeah.
And it is one line where he says, "I'm sorry. No, it must be difficult being my friend."
Yeah.
That is it.
That's it.
Only moment. It's the only moment of self-awareness he has.
It's the only time that I ever found him interesting and sympathetic. I mean, no, he's interesting, but he's interesting in the way, like, watching a documentary about a serial killer is interesting.
Yeah.
So, I think you and I may have taken away what Alan Moore intended with the character. Whereas clearly some other people did not.
Yeah, I mean, you listen, like, you read his narration, and he's horrible.
Yeah, and one of the things I forgot, just because, you know, when we think about it in your head or whatever, you don't necessarily remember the weird, like, broken cadence that he speaks in. So rereading it, it was like really, like, it was very disturbing to read his train of thought where he just speaks in kind of half sentences most of the time.
Yeah.
And like, he's just, his mind is super scattered and he's like looking for these patterns, like the way the inner monologue of like Batman, because he's kind of, you know, he's inspired by like, what if Batman was this real guy that's just insane? And, the way Batman would be like, oh, well, this person had, you know, grew up this way or lives in this place. So therefore this and that and the other thing, kind of like the Sherlock Holmes thing, you know, of putting all the little pieces together. But him, it's just him being an asshole about everything.
Yeah.
And that's
all the time.
The way he makes assumptions about people is just awful. And he really hates women, like, a lot.
Oh my goodness. Well, we're about to dive a little deeper into that one. If you want to do you want to do issue 6?
Yeah, let's do issue 6. And then we're probably going to call it there because, this one is way too big to fit into one episode. So,
yeah.
And we definitely wanted to cover the whole thing because as a work, you have to read the whole thing. There's no way not to.
No half measures around here. Okay, so number 6, The Abyss Gazes also. So Rorschach, now identified as Walter Kovacs, is out of costume and in prison. Dr. Malcolm Long, a prison psychiatrist, shows an ink blot to him, which looks like a dog with its head split in half, though Kovacs lies and says it looks like a pretty butterfly. Long comments in his journal that Kovacs' condition is improving and shows him another ink blot. Kovacs has a flashback to when, as a child, he walked in on his mother having sex. That when this upsets the John, he abruptly leaves. Kovacs' mother then beats her son severely and tells him she should have never had a child. When Long asks Kovacs what he just saw in the ink blot, he humors the doctor again and says, "Some nice flowers." As Kovacs head back to his prison cell, other prisoners threaten and mock him. He recalls a time as a child when he violently attacked 2 bullies for taunting him because his mother was a prostitute. During his next session with Dr. Long, Kovacs recounts the details of how, after realizing how selfish and uncaring humanity was, he crafted a mask to make a face he could bear to look at in the mirror. He also accuses the doctor of being no different than the rest of society's dregs, only wanting to treat him to gain notoriety. Later, in a prison food line, Kovacs throws hot oil on another prisoner's face to avoid getting stabbed with a shiv. For some reason, the recap here is put shiv in, like, quotation marks, and I'm not sure why. It's very curious. Anyway, then, in another session with Long, he discusses his early days working alongside other costume heroes and how he felt the comedian was the only other mask that really understood how the world worked. Further into the session, Kovacs finally admits that the first ink blot looked to him like a dog with its head split in half. He recounts the story of a child kidnapping case in 1975 where he tracked down the kidnapper to his hideout. Upon finding evidence of the girl's rape and murder, Kovacs handcuffed the pleading perpetrator to a pipe inside his hideout and burned the place to the ground. As he gazed at the flames, he felt cleansed. At that moment, he ceased to be Walter Kovacs and became Rorschach. And our closing quote is, "Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you." From Frederick... don't know how to say his last name.
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche? Yeah, let's go with that.
Yeah.
So,
this is, it's interesting, like I said, interesting in the way a documentary about a serial killer is interesting. But interesting nonetheless. I still think it's very well written, but it also illustrates that Rorschach is a bad person. Like, that should be your takeaway from this, because even he talks about in this issue how he was just pretending to be Rorschach before. And this inciting incident with the kidnapper is where he actually became Rorschach for real, where that became the dominant part of his personality. That's even where he starts speaking in these fragmented little, segmented thoughts and stuff, and speaking that way and thinking that way. And before that, in any other scene, if you do see him talk, which is rare, he doesn't have that cadence, So the whole thing with his mom is very messed up.
It is.
I don't know. It's hard to talk a lot about it coming from, a privileged position of having a normal childhood. So it's very shocking. I mean, I'm sure what he was going for.
I'm sure that is what he's going for, but it's like, what this reminds me of? And I hate to bring this up, and I am sure this is exactly what he was aiming for, but obviously he missed the mark because the rest of it sucked. It reminds me of Next Wave Agents of Hate. When bear with me. You'll
never guess that he's a huge Alan Moore fan, by the way.
Oh, God. Anyway, fine. Anyway, it reminds me of the part where I can't remember who the character was because I don't give a shit about any of them. But when they had the flashback and his mum has hung his teddy bear from a noose, it reminded me of that, where it's the childhood is horrible. Look how horrible it is. And you can almost feel like someone is just grabbing your head and sort of smearing it into a pile of dog poo, being like, isn't this bad?
Yeah.
Isn't this really horrible and bad? And look how horrible and bad and messed up it is. And it's well, thanks. I think. Why would you show me? Why was this necessary? The whole thing.
I think it comes from that. It's the same problem with the rape scenes in pretty much everything. Most things. I don't want to say that there aren't times where that could be narratively relevant because, like I said earlier, I'm not the one to speak on that. But I do often feel that these type of things just to show this is why a character is broken. I'm okay, fair, but just coming from a hard background like that or going through a traumatic event like that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to turn out to be a crazy person. And vice versa. Growing up in a, perfectly loving family doesn't necessarily mean you're going to grow up to be a, quote unquote normal person. So it's a very fine line. I can't say I was on board with that whole situation, but, I guess it was effective in showing, that he had a traumatic childhood and, they show the bullies and he doesn't just fight bullies. He beats one of them up so bad and bites a chunk of his face out. It's it's very, very brutal. He doesn't just burn a guy with oil. He completely maims him and he splashes, a huge thing of it onto this guy's head. And he's in intensive care and dies soon after this in the story. It's very, very intense stuff. This is also where the famous quote, about how you all think I'm locked in here with you, but you're locked in here with me, which is admittedly a great line.
It's a great line. Yeah.
That is one of Rorschach does have two of the best lines in this, which is that one and the one about everyone, wanting help and him saying no, whispering no. Those are two very good lines. And Rorschach, unfortunately, is the person who gets them
to deliver them. Yeah.
But honestly, I couldn't see any other character in this book delivering them. Level of delusion of thinking he's so important and that, the world would fall apart if he wasn't there breaking dudes' fingers in a CD bar to get information. That level of delusion could only exist in Rorschach.
Oh, yeah.
So it's appropriate. I can see why unintentionally he became the most popular character because of stuff like that.
Yeah.
What did you think of this one?
I mean, pretty much the same as you. There are very unpleasant parts of it, but it is very well written.
Yeah.
I have to say, whether or not I agree with the choices made about how to kind of present the character's background and things like that, there is no way that I can deny that the characters within it are not very well written. They are.
Right.
The kind of the progression of the relationship between Rorschach and the psychologist is really well done. What happens in the prison, really well done. It's one of those things where there are parts of it that I'm like, oh, that was kind of gross, or I didn't really like that. But I can't say that it isn't good.
Yeah.
Because it is good.
Yeah.
And it's definitely, it's the same as the Dr. Manhattan origin story issue. It's really interesting because the characters are written really well, and irrespective of any other problems that I might have with the comic as a whole kind of work, Alan Moore's a good writer.
Oh, yeah.
There's no possible way that I could deny that he is a good writer. And Dave Gibbons and everyone else who works on this, fantastic job. So this issue is really good. Did I enjoy reading it? 50-50.
Yeah. I have to say though, with the subject matter and everything, enjoying it, I don't think is necessary for it to have been good. If that makes sense. It's we got to eat our vegetables. We got to get through this Rorschach stuff because
that was kind of what I meant. Did I enjoy it in that I had fun, reading it, and I'm like, oh wow, this is really entertaining to read. Oh, this is really cool. No. Did I enjoy it in that I was able to kind of recognize that it was good and kind of appreciate it? Yes.
Yeah. I also did really like how, in a weird way, Rorschach's origin and Dr. Manhattan's origins do have parallels, because the people around them are affected in really bad ways, because the people around Dr. Manhattan, his other relationship falls apart. All the other scientists, are eaten up by guilt the rest of their lives because, this accident happened kind of because he went back, but also kind of because no one was really around, and they kind of mention that some of them kind of always lived with that. Some of them have cancer or have died of cancer now because of being around him. And then with Rorschach's story, this psychologist that's working with him, or psychiatrist, that works for the prison, his marriage falls apart over this.
Oh yeah.
It ruins his life having, Rorschach as one of his patients. Because he becomes obsessed. He can't stop thinking about it. He can't stop trying to figure him out. Which I thought was interesting, because it's kind of in a similar way to, but I think very much more well done, of the whole, people that try and treat the Joker go crazy. That's been a thing, Harley Quinn exists because of that. But she's a good character in some things. I like the character in the animated series. But it's a similar thing. Those characters are just so crazy that it makes everyone else crazy. But I think it was handled really well here. It wasn't, it was believable, I guess is my point. He becomes so obsessed. It's not him trying to solve this puzzle just breaks his brain. It's no, it becomes an obsession, and it ruins his marriage because he won't stop trying to figure this dude out. And I also did as disturbing and brutal as how he truly became Rorschach stuff was, I think it worked well. Again, not pleasant to read, but very interesting and well done, and shows why he is, as messed up as he is, because that case broke him, is the whole point,
Yeah.
But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this one. We gotta call it, because we've been going for a while. So, I'm just going to say initial thoughts, for these first 6 issues was, not easy to get through some of it, but I think worth it.
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree with that.
But I don't want to give too much yet because we'll get into final thoughts in the next episode more. We'll wrap it up there, and you can check us out on, Twitter, Geekly Inc., everywhere we are. Just look for Inks and Issues and you'll find us. Kieran, where else can people find you?
You can find me on the internet. I'm at Mr. K_Bennett. You can also check out my Dungeons and Dragons podcast, which is for crits and giggles. That is at for CNG podcast on Twitter. Jonah, where can people find you on the internet?
I'm on Twitter at Spambot. And pretty much that and Inks and Issues stuff, which we will have more information right here.
Need more mutants, metahumans, and monsters in your life? Then check out these other Geekly Inc. shows like Brute Force, Cast of Thrones, or You're a Wizard, Harry. Help us make the show the best that it can be by supporting us at patreon.com/inksandissues, where you can get bonus content, early access to episodes, and can even vote on comics for us to review. And don't forget to leave a 5-star review to help us spread the word. Interact with us on Twitter at inksandissues or on Twitch at twitch.tv/inksandissues. Now do yourself a favor and go read some gosh dang comics.
All right. And with that, we will see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye. Love you.
The Reds are polluting the city lake. What do we do? We call the Watchmen.
Strong together, united forever, they're the best of friends. But when trouble's about, you'd best watch out for the Watchmen.
Night Owl is their leader, and he loves to party down. Rorschach's rents to the animals.
Yeah, when he's not clowning around.
Why nutty?
Beat up some thugs, say no to drugs, be in bed by 10. But if trouble's about, you'd best watch out for the Watchmen.
Spectre's a sensation, you should really never miss her. The comedian's your biggest fan now.
If I could only get that kiss.
OCM, pure bastards, couple of crime-solving superstars. John can give you cancer, and they'll turn into a car.
Strong together, united forever, come and meet your friends. Have no fear, time's up, time's here, for the Watchmen.